back to another video here on Free Will Photos. We are making a black and white portrait inside of ON1 Photo Raw. So let's just jump into the computer and get started. The very first thing that I like to do whenever I am converting a photo to black and white is I come over to my camera profile and change this. Now I use either portrait or neutral. And the goal that I'm going for here is just flattening out the overall tonality, the look in the image, because I want to craft that the way I want when I convert this to black and white. Now, if for whatever reason, to help you see what I'm talking about a little bit better, I'm going to come over to effects and I'm going to add a black and white filter. Now you can see there are some contrasting looking areas in the image. And what I want to do is show you, if I use portrait, you see how it's all flat, like everything is essentially gray. Now, this is just the way that I like to work. And I particularly like to work in this fashion when I'm working on a portrait. And you'll see why here in a little bit. Because I don't want too much contrast in the portrait that I'm not in direct control of. So what I prefer is a more flat canvas, and then I build in the contrast on my own. But that's enough of that. I'm going to go with ON1 neutral. That's the camera profile that I want to add. Now, because this is a raw image, there is some developing that's required. And one of the best ways to figure out what you really need to do with an image is to come to the histogram and take a look at where your light is spread across your dynamic range. As you can see, this photo, a lot of information is to the right, not much is over to the left of the photo. So what that tells me is I need to bring back some of the tonality on the left side. Now, there's a few different ways that you can do it. I'm just going to pull down on the black point here, and I think that brings everything where it needs to be. So before, well, and the before and after won't really work, but if I were to reset this, and then if I just pull this down, it's a very subtle adjustment, but it's a very necessary adjustment for the rest of what we're going to be doing with the black and white photo. That is everything that I'll do on this particular image in the develop module, because I actually exposed it very, very well. All right. And that's something I think everyone should pay attention to. If you're not exposing your photos properly before you get them into the edit window, you're really causing a lot of extra work for yourself that you don't need to. So expose it right in camera makes it a lot easier to edit your photos in post-production. So the next place that I'm going to go is over to the effects. And what I can do is start modifying this image using the black and white filter here. But that's only going to give me one instance of where I want to really control my photo. Now, there's a few different options that I have available to me, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to jump over to the local tab. All right. And with the local tab, what I want to do is change the blend mode of my adjustment over to luminosity. And the reason I'm doing this is because I only want to impact the luminance as I start to work with my image. And yes, I'm working in a black and white photo, but if you don't change it to luminosity, you can really start to introduce some different looks, which that may be something you want to go for, but then you may say, well, why wasn't I getting that pure adjustment that I wanted? And so now it's time to actually start making some modifications. The first thing I like to do is just invert. And if you already know, I have my Elgato, and I like to use my Elgato to help me move along faster. So if you see me reaching, it's because I'm using my Stream Deck to actually use keyboard shortcuts or macros, but you can use keyboard shortcuts as well if you so choose. And I hope you do choose, because it helps you move a lot faster. What I've done so far is I've added a local adjustment and I lowered the exposure. Now that's just the default value, and that's okay. because what I really want to do is start to craft, again, that contrast all over the image. So what I really like to do here is pull this all the way down until I get to a point where I think the skin looks the best. All right. I like to work with the skin first. Okay. So if I pull this all the way, or pull this up, you can see her skin, it's a little washed out, and based off of what her skin tone actually is, I feel like it should be a little bit darker. I really appreciate that. So what I want to do is pull this down until the skin gets right to where I think it ought to be. Okay. And I think this is a good place for it to be. So if I turn this off and turn it back on, I think that looks just the way that I want it to look. Now, what I'm going to do is click invert one more time, and that hides all of the adjustments that I just made to this particular image. I'm going to click on the mask, or I'm going to click on color range, and then I'm going to grab the eyedropper here, and I'm just going to click on her skin. All right. Now, if I hit the letter O, you'll see that it samples a whole lot, and I don't want it to sample that much. I want it to really just focus on her skin. So what I'm going to do is pull down on this range slider until it gets pretty close to the areas that I want it to be. And I'm not worried so much about the background as much as I am just what's on her skin. And then I'm going to feather this. So that's just going to essentially spread that mask out a little bit further. And now when I hit the letter O and I take this away, you can see that it's only applied to that area, but it doesn't look very good. So maybe what I need to do, we'll play around with the levels here just to see if I can adjust this. And I love doing this type of stuff in real time, because this is how you learn to really develop a mask in your overall image. But I don't think that this is going to work. So instead, I'm going to reset the mask, and I'm just going to use a brush. And what I'm going to do is put a pretty low opacity. I like to paint with a low opacity personally whenever I use the brush. So I'll use a 20. And I'm just going to paint this adjustment in on the areas that I really want it. So I know that I wanted her skin to be just a little bit darker. So I'm going to do this. Now, this is obviously very subjective and stylistic. So if your style doesn't require this type of work, then that's okay. But my style, and for this particular image, I think I really do want that. And what I really appreciate about doing it this way, right, is her skin has different levels. Like if we were to go back to the color image or the unedited version, you can see she has highlights here, it's darker over there, and so forth and so on, right? Well, when I'm painting over her skin using the luminosity, all I'm doing is adjusting the luminance value. And what I can really do is just start to hone in those areas where I would like her skin to be just a little bit darker versus what she was exposed at. So that's the beauty of painting with a low opacity. Everything doesn't need the exact same adjustment. Like I'm actually okay with making this a little bit darker because it's in shadow. And, you know, you can say that this is kind of like burning, which it somewhat is. But what it's doing is I want to bring more attention to her eyes, which is why I'm making her skin a little bit darker, because what I'm going to do is ultimately brighten her eyes. And that's what I love about having a flat canvas where I can just manipulate the light the way that I want it. Now, I don't want to get rid of all of the highlights on her nose. So I'm actually going to go with a paint out smaller brush, and I'm going to bring back some of those highlights because it's all about contour, right? The face has to have some shape to it. So I think that works. And then I'll just darken this area over here because I think that would be okay. Now, what I can also do is start to darken her hair because I don't need that much detail in her hair. So, and in fact, I can bring my brush opacity up for this because I'm okay with the hair. I'll bring it down to about 80, 78 will do. And I'm just going to go over some of the streaks in her hair. Doesn't have to be perfect. This is just my way of making her hair less important, essentially. And, you know, this is kind of like coloring, or at least the way that I look at it. It's kind of like coloring. And I'll just kind of fade that in to the into the background there. So let's go ahead and turn this off and turn it back on. And you can see we're starting to really shape the face a little bit more. Now, like I mentioned, I did want to work on her eyes. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to call this skin burn, so that way we know what it is. And that's not a derogatory thing. This is just a photography edit, where if you darken something, it's called burning. It's a photography term. Now what we're going to do is come back to luminosity, and this time I'm going to dodge or make things brighter. Now I'm going to invert my mask because I want to see what is actually happening when I make this adjustment across the entire image, and it helps me see where I would like this adjustment to actually be added in my overall image. So I think that that's pretty good, and I like what it's doing with her eyes. I'm going to turn off the mask or invert it and uninvert it, and I like what it's doing. So I'm going to come over here to her eyes, and this one I'm going to paint with probably about a 40% opacity. Yeah, we'll go with a 40%. I'm just going to paint right over her eyes, the whole area of her eyes here. And what I'm noticing is shooting through her glasses made her eyes not as sharp. So I am going to have to throw some structure into her eyes, but we'll do that here in a little bit. Now, when it comes to adjusting eyes, what I like to do is really open up shadows and see what that does for the overall look, especially when you're working with luminosity. As the blend mode, I don't have to worry about adjusting anything else except for the tonal range. So, and then I also like to contrast it, right? So that's making her eyes pop just that much more. Now, what I'm going to do, and we'll call this Dodge Eyes. Now it's time for me to modify her actual eyes and make them sharper. So what I'm going to do here is just crank up the structure a little bit, and I'm going to invert this just to see what it looks like over the entire image. Because if I turn this off and turn it back on, you can see it's really making the entire image look really good. And I like that. However, I'm only looking at her eyes right now, and I think that that's going to do me some good. And now I'm going to pull around on the haze slider, because sometimes when you shoot through glass, using the dehaze slider can really help bring back some of that fine-tuned detail. So I'm just playing around here, seeing if I like anything, but I really don't see anything happening. So I'm just going to reset that to 0 and invert the sharpening for the eyes. And now it's time to paint that in over the eyes. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, Chris, why aren't you using the portrait AI? Because you could do all of this using the AI features built in and save yourself some time and headache. And you're not wrong. There is a pro to using the portrait AI, but I personally prefer working on things step by step, using controls that are using methods that give me a lot of control. So if that's something you're into, I'm showing you that this is what you can do. So just want to make sure that that is shining through, and it's actually very, very subtle. So what I want to do is contrast it, because I want those eyes to really pop. And you can see when I contrast it, if I turn this off and turn it back on, you can really see the difference that this makes with the eyes. The last step that I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the masking bug, and you guys have probably seen me do this on plenty of my images, but I'm going to show you a different method of what I'm going to do. So I'm just clicking once using a vignette masking bug. I'm going to put this, really, it's going to come in, and I'm just going to make it the shape or the width of her eyes. And since her head is turning, what I'm essentially doing is taking this little circle here and this little circle here and making it right about where her eyes, like the outside portion of her eyes here. So if you look right in here, it's kind of hard to tell with the glasses, but that's where I want to put this, right? And I put it right at her eye level. And then what I do is I'm going to play around with how I feather this off, because I don't want the rest of the photo to be brighter than the focal point, which is her eyes. All right. And that's just a typical portrait technique. So what I'm going to do is just bring down this exposure and look at how dramatic and how much attention grabbing this photo has just become. Now, it does look a little staged, right? And this is where I'm going to pull down on the structure, because I don't need anything else to really be sharp. So I'm going to pull down on the structure just a little bit there. And then I'm also going to pull down on the black points for everything that's outside of her face. So everything else gets darker, but her face, it stays nice and well lit. And then, because I know that this is a little heavy-handed, all I'm going to do is pull down on the opacity until it gets to a point where it looks like it would have been a nice, natural look on the day. Now, one last thing that I'll do, and I say this often in my photo editing videos, but I'm going to hit the letter C to pull up my cropping tool. And I normally use triangles for a lot of things, but today I'm going to come to the rule of thirds. And what I really want to do is have her eyes above this line. And the reason for that, there's more interest to the photo when the eyes are at the top third and everything else is underneath. So I'm just going to pull this up a little bit so that way I get some room, and I'm going to pull this down. And I think something like that will probably work. And I could probably expand this like so. And I do like something, and I'll make her eyes more centered because I think that that looks the best. So I'm going to keep it like so, hit apply. And I did leave it on original ratio, but to me, this is a more compelling photo. I think I framed it up quite well when I originally snapped it, but now I think that it's a little bit more compelling. Now, I know I always say one last thing, but for the sake of just having fun with photography and photo editing, one last thing. I'm going to hit add filter, and I'm going to drop a border filter on here. Now, one of the things that I really enjoy doing with my black and whites is putting borders on them. And I like this very simple border. To me, it just elevates it, especially if I'm not going to print it. If I was going to print this, I would probably not put this particular border around it. But by default, I think the border is just a little too thick overall. So what I like to do is just pull down on the scale and make the border just a little bit smaller. I normally go somewhere around 8 or 9, just depending on the photo. But I think for this image, I think 8 looks pretty good. And again, this is just a personal preference. With black and whites, I do enjoy putting borders on them. And I don't do it all the time, but I wanted to do it for this particular image. So here is the before, which is a great image, and I could absolutely modify this in color and be very content. And here is the after, the black and white. This is something that I really do adore and appreciate. I think it truly captures the essence of my daughter, and I just wanted to share that with you. Now, if you want to pick up a copy of ON1 Photo Raw and save a little bit of money when you do it, consider using the coupon code FreeWillPhotos20 at checkout. It is an affiliate link. I do make a small commission, but it's at no extra charge to you. In fact, you get to save a little bit of money. So if you got questions about ON1 Photo Raw, editing inside of ON1, or black and white photos in ON1, leave it in the comment section below, and I'd love to get back to you. Until next time, I want you to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.